This video is brought to you by Knowledge at the Australian School of Business.
Bad things often happen to new technologies. They experience a sizzle and then a fizzle. In other words, people get very enthusiastic early on, and that's followed by collapse. That can happen for many reasons. Economic, there just isn't the right investment, social, or even for political reasons. This failure has been highlighted by alternative fuel vehicles. It was thought, maybe a decade or two ago, that we'd have run out of oil by now, and so everybody would be driving either an electric car or some other alternative fuel vehicle. And yet, patently, we're not. Exactly why has been researched by Professor John Sterman. He's from the MIT Sloan School of Management, and he's at the Australian School of Business as a Michael J. Crouch Visiting Professor. He's also over here for the 35th anniversary of AGSM. So, John, let's look at this initially. Why do we get this initial burst of enthusiasm when it does seem to be a new technology?
Well, Julian, there are many reasons for this. In the context of alternative fuel vehicles, which is an area of particular importance for our society, given the risks of climate change, limitations, and national security issues around the availability of oil, rising prices, etc. This is something that we've been studying for some time now. In the case of vehicles, you have plenty of wonderful new technologies for alternatives to the dominant internal combustion engine or ICE gasoline-powered vehicle. Electric, biodiesel, potentially hydrogen, etc. But there's a long, long history, going back decades, of attempts to introduce these alternatives that went through this pattern of sizzle and fizzle. So compressed natural gas vehicles in Argentina, in Canada, the United States, and in New Zealand all started out with great promise. There was uptake. People were buying these vehicles, but then the market would fizzle out. So what's going on there? Well, in the case of vehicles, a major problem is the infrastructure chicken and egg problem. Nobody is going to buy an alternative vehicle if they can't be sure that they can get fuel for it anytime and anywhere. Even if they don't drive anytime, anywhere, they feel that they must have ubiquitous fuel availability. But of course, the energy supply companies are not going to be willing to invest the hundreds of billions of dollars that it takes to articulate that infrastructure until they're sure there's a market. So no infrastructure, no attractiveness for the vehicles, no purchases of those vehicles, no investment in infrastructure. You have a reinforcing feedback that's acting as a vicious cycle that damps down innovation. That's just the start, though. Right now, today, these alternative vehicles are more expensive than conventional vehicles, and you can't get the variety of makes and models and options and so forth that you can get on the conventional vehicles. Now, we know that if the industry develops through scale economies, through learning curve effects, that the price and performance and variety of these vehicles will all improve dramatically. There's no question that that's going to happen. But how do you get the scale without the market? So you have a situation where you can't get going without a push. And unfortunately, a push in the form of subsidies or tax incentives, marketing programs, guarantees for the fuel providers, those programs, which have been put in place in many of these countries that experience sizzle and fizzle, they tend to be too little and for too short a time to push that market over the hill, over the tipping point, to the point where it's self-sustaining.
So, John, how have you researched this?
We've been developing a set of computer simulation models that mimic the way people drive, where they need to go, length of their trips, etc., whether they get range anxiety about how much fuel or electricity is left in their vehicle, how they make the purchase decision about a vehicle. But also the model has a very broad boundary, so it also includes the behavior of the automakers. How do they allocate R&D among different kinds of vehicles? How fast do those vehicles improve with scale and learning? And also the supply chain for the critical components, the fuel infrastructure. So it's a multi-actor simulation, a behavioral model that captures how people buy cars, how they choose to drive, how the autos are developed and sold, pricing, features, performance, and the behavior of the fuel providers that create the infrastructure to fill up your vehicle.
But isn't this natural? After all, many people will get enthusiastic about a new technology when it's first announced of here's a great answer that may save the climate, if not the world, and maybe cheaper in the future. And then there's a very long lead time before anything is developed. After all, look at the internal combustion engine. And I know a lot of your research looked at how the internal combustion engine was initially launched, and then it took many years before it was adopted in the 1880s, 1890s.
Absolutely, and the early history of the automobile industry is very instructive here. Internal combustion was actually a latecomer to the party for automobiles. There were steam automobiles first. Now, this is actually not a great technology because before you can hop in your car and go down to the grocer, you have to build up a head of steam, and it was inconvenient. But there were also electric vehicles early on, and they were the early movers in the market. They were widely considered to be safe and quiet and convenient in the cities, and were already being used, taxis, for example. Internal combustion came late. Now, with electric vehicles back then, it was hard to expand the electric grid fast enough to allow people to recharge out in the countryside or between towns. But it was pretty easy to get gasoline in every little town. Now, one of the interesting things here is that because vehicles back then were extremely inefficient and broke down a lot and were extremely uncomfortable, and the roads were bad, you basically had to stop. If you were driving from, say, Boston to New York on the post road, you had to stop in every town for fuel or water or repair or just to stretch your aching back. And so that created demand for fuel infrastructure at every town along the way. Today, what we're facing is two problems. First is the range we expect, the range that an alternative vehicle needs to offer to be attractive has to be hundreds of kilometers. And so you're not going to need to stop everywhere, and that reduces the incentive for infrastructure investment. Second problem, of course, is when internal combustion entered the market in around the turn of the 20th century, it was a new market. It wasn't saturated. There were no real competitors other than horses. We've had more than 100 years of dominance by the ICE gasoline combine, and we're very, very good at making highly reliable traditional cars. They're cheap, their performance is terrific, you can get any kind of car you want. So the threshold for an alternative vehicle to become attractive is much, much higher now than it was 110 years ago.
And also, they don't look that different from existing cars. When the first cars came onto the road, they were very different. You had that word-of-mouth factor coming in of everybody would talk about the latest development, the new model they'd seen.
That's a huge factor. And I have to say that some car companies have recognized this and done very well. So Toyota, for example, styled the Prius so it was instantly recognizable. Whether you like it or not, you can instantly tell that's a Prius when it's rolling down the street. You can't tell for many of the other hybrids that it's a hybrid. It looks just like a Camry, it looks just like a Focus, it looks just like an Altima, and you can't tell that it's hybrid. And that weakens the development of awareness and familiarity, which then suppresses market development.
And you've also got to deal with the factors that a failure of one development may lead to a perception that the whole technology is flawed, even when it actually seems to be working.
This is a really interesting paradox. People are completely habituated to the idea that you're driving around on top of 80 liters of highly explosive gasoline. No problem. But people are incredibly fearful of driving around with a battery or with a tank of hydrogen or whatever the alternative fuel might be. So it just will take one Hindenburg, and it could set back the entire platform for quite a while. So safety, which is of course important all the time, is even more important in the context of the alternative vehicles.
And there are other alternative fuels as well that seem to be very successful, but only in niche markets. If you look at ethanol, for example, in some South American countries, it's been widely adopted. You can almost smell it on the streets, that very sweet, sticky smell.
Right. So Brazil is a great example here. But what's not as well known about Brazil's transition to ethanol is that they failed in their first attempt. So they have sugarcane resources that are able to make ethanol relatively cheaply and without having to import expensive foreign oil. But the first time they tried to go with an ethanol-based vehicle system, it was based on 100% ethanol. And that meant incompatible fuel infrastructure. And for the reasons we discussed, it fizzled after a promising start. They relaunched their ethanol program, but this time with a blend. So today it's flex fuel, E85, 85% ethanol. And vehicles are all flex fuel, so you can flip a switch, you can run on either. And this appears to be successful because the flex fuel option allows you to obviate the infrastructure problem. Biofuels are very promising. Ethanol from sugarcane, the life cycle analysis suggests it's probably better than gasoline, but in the United States, where we're making our ethanol today from corn, it's pretty clear from the life cycle assessments that that is actually not helping us with climate change. It's displacing land from food production to fuel production and pushing up corn prices. This causes serious problems for poor people around the world who can't afford then to eat. And on top of it, ethanol-based fuel from corn uses so much fossil fuel and has such deleterious impacts on the fertility of the land, pesticides, herbicides, runoff of fertilizers, etc. It may even be increasing the net carbon emissions. So if we're going to go down the biofuel route, we're going to have to find a way to do it with what's called third-generation biofuels, cellulosic feedstocks for ethanol, genetically engineered biofuels coming from algae. People are working on this intensively, but it's not ready for prime time yet.
And in fact, the lead times on that seems to be enormous. I mean, we're talking about maybe 20 or 30 years before we get any successes, whereas we can go out and, I could just go out and buy an electric vehicle now, but there's still that perception that the battery life just isn't quite good enough. And people have been trying to develop this for, again, maybe 100 years or so. They can't get the battery technology quite right.
People do face a challenge right now. The range you can get in a Nissan Leaf is under 100 miles. In a Chevy Volt, which is a hybrid, so it'll run on gasoline when the battery is depleted, is about 35 to 40 miles. But it has the gasoline engine, and I've driven it. It's a terrific car. It's not doing very well in the marketplace right now because it's expensive, but it solves the range problem. You do give up cargo space in the vehicle given the energy density of the batteries right now. I think there's going to be progress on that front. There's a lot of exciting new technologies, whether it's ultracapacitors or nanomaterials to increase the charge density in a battery. There's tremendously exciting things going on. We'll probably get where we need to go. Charging time remains an issue. It can take, with conventional power out of the wall, 4 to 8 hours to charge your vehicle. Well, that's fine if you're home and you can charge it overnight, but it's not fine if you're out on the road and your battery is run down. So another model that's being proposed is the battery swap technology that's being pioneered by Better Place, which is active here in Australia. I believe you can now buy the Better Place vehicle, which is called the Renault Fluence. The idea there is you won't actually own the battery. You'll rent it in the way you have a cell phone and buy minutes, and you'll drive into a battery swap station when your battery is running down, and a robot will unscrew the current battery and put a fully charged replacement in at no additional cost to you. Take no more time than a conventional filling station, and while you're waiting, you can order a soda and a snack. But the problem is, in order for it to be successful, every automaker would have to agree to design their car with the same standard for the battery design, and they're not willing to do that right now. So the lack of agreement about standards, whether it's charging, plug shape, or even signage, signs that will indicate this is a parking space with a charge point and it's reserved for electric vehicles only, park here with a conventional car and you'll pay a big fine, the same way we have universally recognized signage for handicap parking spots. We don't even have standards on that. So the lack of the standards delays and slows the adoption and diffusion of these technologies and can keep them from becoming economically sustainable.
And you also have got to recognize that maybe some technologies will work in one country, but they won't work in another, where just the design of the cities are different, or the infrastructure is different. I'm thinking of, say, an electric car that will work perfectly in Berlin or Paris, perfectly designed for an electric car, except you trip over as you're walking along the pavement people who run an electric cable just to charge up their car.
Right. So the problem of providing charge points for on-street parking spaces remains unsolved largely. How are you going to bill for it? All these are technically solvable, but there's no standard, there's no agreement, and as a result, people improvise, and you get this extension cord problem and power theft and so forth. I actually think those are all solvable problems. The real issue, though, and we've been talking about vehicles, is there are just too many cars. For example, if everybody in the world lived and drove the way Australians do today, global greenhouse emissions would be 172 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year, which is something like 5 times more than total world emissions today, at a time when we need to reduce emissions by about 80% by 2050 in order to avoid the worst risks of climate change. If everybody drove like Australians do today, you'd have over 5 billion private vehicles on the roads, and they would take up an area larger than the country of Austria just in parking spaces, without any of the roads to get the cars out of that lot. So this is not going to happen. We're going to need more mass transit. We're going to need alternatives to vehicles. You're probably aware of the multi-day 60-kilometer-long traffic jam in China from 2010. This is just the beginning. Too many cars. So yes, we're still going to have private vehicles. We're still going to want to do that, but we're going to need more light rail, more trams, more buses, more intercity trains in order to address the problem of mass mobility in a world of 9.3 billion people by 2050.
It's an issue that many people in Australia, and come to that around the world, have been discussing for many years, and I'm sure will be for a long time to come. John, it's been great talking to you. Thank you.
Pleasure, Julian. Thanks.
For more business news and analysis from Knowledge at the Australian School of Business, please visit knowledge.asb.unsw.edu.au.